Okay, so welcome everybody to another session with Kettlebell Sport Almanac. We have James Ross with us today to talk about some of the benefits of kettlebell sport. So James, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Thanks. I think I got my first kettlebell about 2006 or so, around when Enter the Kettlebell came out. I've been a personal trainer for a couple of years before that, so I've been training people for about 22, 3 years. And I was very fortunate that one of the first gyms I went to had a kettlebell sport athlete, Emily Friedel, and she's probably one of the first Australian kettlebell sport lifters. And I was doing track and field and doing more hard style stuff initially. And of course, being a bit ambitious and a bit younger, gave myself a really advanced program that I wasn't ready for, and I got all these injuries. So I ended up doing kettlebell sport because I could really only lift a 16 kilo bell at the time, where I've gone from building up to like double snatches with the 36s and some other things like that. And then from there, I've gone on to do some research into kettlebell sport. So a couple of master's degrees, and I was doing a PhD, which was actually on the kettlebell swing, probably more from a strength and conditioning standpoint, because it is hard to get the unis wanting to, like, or your supervisors to want to do specifically kettlebell sport stuff, because it's how that world works is in academia. It's about like how many times people are going to reference it and things like that. So you want a broader appeal, even though I think we can all see the value in kettlebell sport, um, particularly across a range of different um, cohorts or age groups. Like I couldn't imagine there's too many other sports where you can really excel getting into it later on. Yesterday at a competition, we've got older ladies doing military snatch with 20 kilos, closing in on high, nearly 200 reps, later on in life, which is really awesome, and things like that. So I guess I've been a coach, um, an athlete, and I've done research into kettlebell sport and kettlebells and strength and conditioning in general. So um, been fortunate enough to be master of sport for about 10 years as well. That just clicked over for this year. Initially, I got my first MS in long cycle with two 20s in a half marathon, and then later on, sort of one arm long cycle, half marathon, and in the same year, just long cycle, and then the following year, biathlon, and then triathlon after that. So yeah, I've been lucky to have some longevity in the sport as well.
So do you think that since we're talking about longevity, what do you feel like the long-term effects are, positive or negative, for people, that are lifting now, looking at 10, 20, 30 years down the road? Because, um, something like powerlifting, uh, there can be a lot of long-term effects when you're under significant amounts of load over, decades of training. How do you think that that translates with kettlebell sport?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. It's something I think about a lot, actually. So kettlebell sport, if you take a step back, is typically we've got a few different elements. We've obviously got the technique and the mastery of the technique, which is also in powerlifting. We've got the strength aspect, which is obviously the main thing in powerlifting, but then we've got flexibility and endurance. And so you sort of combine all of those different things for the kettlebell sport. And I think one of the really magical things about kettlebell sport, which you don't get in too many other lifting sports, but you get a lot in other sports in general, is the relaxation element. So specifically, say if you look at powerlifting, obviously that's really good for building muscle mass and bone mass and tendons and things like that. But um, often, not for everyone, but a lot of people, lifting long term does really take a toll, like lifting like that. And um, we can break down forces that you sort of expose your body to during your lifting, and you've got your internal forces, like the force that the muscle exerts, like for example on the spine, and then you've got your external forces. So if you're running, um, uh, say when you're running, jogging, your foot hits the ground or your heel hits the ground, and it's like 2 times body weight goes through, um, the heel. But then the Achilles tendon exerts like 3 times body weight on the heel when you're running, and that's really great for bone mineral density. Or if you apply that to powerlifting in the spine, the actual internal forces of the muscles contracting super hard when you brace is often more than the external load. And when you're bracing and just switching on 100% all the time, it's again fantastic for building strength and all that sort of stuff. But there isn't really the nuance that kettlebell sport has, in the sense that we have rapid contraction and then relaxation cycles. So when you're doing a snatch, you're going to switch on really high for a split second, then it's going to come back down. And then you've got that element of relaxing and things like that. So, and then that's much more like when you're running and you're changing direction, you have a spike in activity and it drops down. Or if you're doing martial arts, you'll have this spike, but then you need to be relaxed to be fast and things like that. So I think that's probably one of the things that really differentiates kettlebell sport is, one, you've got that endurance element, and then two, you've got that relaxation element. And in terms of long term, um, yeah, I mean, the proof's in the pudding. You see so many, I mean, you do in powerlifting as well. You do see sort of masters athletes and things like that, but a lot of people can do it for a really long time with really low rates of injury. They often come to it, like myself, after doing other sports and they've had injuries, and they seem to be able to find a lift that works for them. Sometimes people struggle with doubles when they get into it later, but if you chip away at it, oftentimes that flexibility will come around. So I think that's a really unique aspect. And it's also just coming back to the spine thing. In people with lower back pain, typically their spine, the musculature around the spine stays switched on. And when you bend forward, your spine should, once you get past a certain point, should actually, the muscle activity should relax and it should switch over to just being passive. So having that, reinforcing that action of switching on and switching off and being able to relax is actually really important just for health and how you feel within your body, because it's, most serious powerlifters often have really like aches and pains, and I'm just speculating, but maybe it's because they're just used to switching on like 100% all the time. So the volume's always maxed out. Whereas in kettlebell sport, we have a greater range. We've got relaxation, and then we've got spikes and things like that. And often people do squats as well, but so you can get the sort of the best of both worlds there. I hope that makes sense.
I think, probably, and obviously, I'm not like crazy into the powerlifting world, but when you're lifting, extremely heavy loads and constantly, you're trying to move up, there is always that, um, greater possibility for injury. Um, Especially when it's, done over years. I mean, most powerlifters have had something. But I think there are generally, when I'm working with people or people that I know, that there are usually less injuries. I think just because it is a much lighter load that you're moving around than, really anything that you'd be doing for more traditional strength training. So it's the because the load is so much less, it's just the likelihood of injury is then lower, right? Because your muscles aren't maxed out, right? And rather you're maxing out usually cardiovascularly, and eventually you get to muscle fatigue. But so
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I always think about is with deadlifts, we've got, like in kettlebell sport versus a snatch, I guess, we've got the self-limiting factor of the grip, particularly if it's single hand changes or if it's half marathon or military snatch, you've got probably more the cardio thing that is the limiting factor. And often with deadlifting, I'm not a powerlifting coach, but people, if you're teaching relatively strict form deadlifting, people maintain that. But once you get to that, max effort, 1 RM effort, often there starts to be a bit more rounding and things like that. And if people aren't used to lifting like that, that's when they can get into a bit of trouble. And sort of the cost to benefit sometimes, unless you're competing in powerlifting and regularly maxing out, it's it's sometimes not worth it, I guess. Whereas kettlebell sport, yeah, there's a whole range of different things that can be the limiting factor. Which again, I think, like you said, it's sort of got a built-in, or like with deadlifting, if you just only do double overhand grip, your grip will pretty much, but the majority of people give out before your back does. And
Mhm.
that's kind of a good example of what happens in kettlebell sport, I guess.
What do you think is kind of unique about kettlebell sport in compared to other ways of developing your strength and endurance?
Yeah. So, well, I guess if we take the endurance aspect, I don't know who said this, but I don't know if it was Pavel or just someone else on the internet, but it kind of made sense, which is like the the best way to get your heart rate up without leaving the ground. So, obviously when you're jogging and running and things like that, um, I mean, maybe some people do leave the ground a little bit when they snatch, but most people will keep their feet on the ground. And as a consequence, when you do a snatch, like with a 24, um, you probably get like 1.5 times body weight going through each leg, depending on how you snatch. If you've got that sort of modern style where you're switching between legs, or if you've sort of got that classic style where you use both legs and it kind of looks a little bit more like traditional weightlifting, there's usually a bit less for that classic snatch. But you don't have these huge spikes in ground reaction force when your heel's hitting the ground. Um, and, uh, you know, running is a fantastic way to get your heart rate up and things like that. But again, as you age, unless you keep up running and things like that, often it can be a harder thing to get back into. Um, so that's one aspect. So I think a lot more people can do kettlebell sport or a kettlebell sport lift without some of the troubles that they have with running. And then if you switch over to strength stuff, um, yeah, you've got this relaxation benefit as well. And I think ultimately, like you're alluding to before, we don't have to just do it in a vacuum. Um, you can, like a lot of people will do some running, but you don't have to do as much as if you're just a runner. And you can do some powerlifting, but you don't have to do as much as if you're a powerlifter. So you can just sort of do the minimum effective dose of those other things and focus on kettlebell lifting, and you get a really well-rounded um, development. But if you're just doing kettlebells, I think um, I'm sure during different times when people don't have access to gyms, or they're really limited on time, kettlebell sport or kettlebell training is just such an effective way to train, that you can train so many elements like strength, endurance, power, balance, all these different things in a really short period of time. Whether it's just the swing or the snatch, you you're getting so many benefits and in just a couple of exercises, which is really good, and it doesn't take up much room. So if you've just got a garage and you've got a few bells, you can get so much out of it.
So are you saying, is that whiskey? Oh, it's coffee.
It's tea actually, but
Oh.
yeah.
Are you
Um,
saying that kettlebell sport, like I could just replace kettlebell sport with all my other cardio? Like I could just not do other types of cardio? Or is there still a benefit of doing traditional types of cardio, on a bike, running, rowing, whatever? Or, does kettlebell sport offer enough cardio that you really don't need that?
yeah, that's a great question. So
I'm glad you
I
think so.
think with kettlebell sport, I think if you're just looking for general fitness, you can cover off all your bases. If you're trying to optimize other things, I think adding a little bit of cycling would be useful if you're having trouble recovering from running or in between sessions. Um, because cycling is just that concentric only, so there's less muscle damage, um, and so that can be quite useful. And you can use like a really light contrasting, so you can work on higher cadence, and you can have a really light resistance, or just cycle and things like that. And likewise with running, you um, yeah, I usually don't recommend sprinting unless you're a runner or a sprinter and things like that. But jogging or faster intervals is probably okay. So that can be useful in addition to your kettlebell sport if you're trying to optimize, say, your VO2 max or things like that. So there's a there isn't much research on kettlebell sport, but often there's a bit more of an anaerobic component with kettlebell sport. And I don't think they've found the optimal sort of protocol in the research, at least for VO2 max training with kettlebell sport or kettlebell training in general. And often they see a slightly lower oxygen cost than, say, running. So you
I
might
think
have to say
also
that.
if anybody's, tried to do, if they're at an exercise sport facility or whatever, tried to do a VO2 max test. I have, but I think that it's difficult to max out on it because um when you're getting towards the end where you need to get, the intensity is just really high. And then you have to try and battle through being able to lift the load, versus in running, like, not that you can just kind of keep going, but it's only your own weight. So I feel like it's easier on a treadmill to do it than trying to max it out under bells and then trying to figure out what weight you need to max out with. Because when I've done it before, if I'm doing it at my my competition weight, it's very hard for me to, well, one, I have to get in the mindset that I'm going to lift 10 minutes for with the 24s. And I don't really like to do that because it's really unenjoyable.
Yeah,
So, trying to be in that mindset when you're not at competition to try and push through what you would normally push through to get a real reading, versus when you're on, with the maybe a lighter weight. So, like you're saying for protocol, like exactly what weight do we go to based on your ability to be able to allow you to get to that max effort.
yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head with that one, because with kettlebell sport, particularly when you're lifting 24s, the minimum force you need to perform a rep is quite high, right? Whereas with running, it's so much lower, and you can kind of keep digging deep to push further and further. And when we at uni do VO2 max tests, if someone wasn't actually a really fast runner, what we would do is, so we'd typically, most of the VO2 max protocols, you do a multi-stage incremental test. So you'd start slow and then you progressively build up the speed. But when you get to a certain running speed, a lot of people will just fall off the back of the treadmill and they're not at their VO2 max. So what you can do is just crank the incline up. So that's often one way to get around that. It's not as useful for training purposes if you do that. So you get your VO2 max, which is useful if you do a pre and post test. But oftentimes, if you do your VO2 max and you keep it flat for a runner, you can be like, oh, your VO2 max running speed is at, you know, 5 meters per second or whatever, and then you can plan your intervals around that. And typically, training around that VO2 max speed or velocity is the best way to improve it. And yeah, if you're lifting kettlebells and you use your heart rate, for example, if you're lifting slower with 24s, your heart rate might be very similar to if you're lifting faster with 20s, but the oxygen cost might be different because there's a whole range of different things. So when you're doing a lower frequency snatch or jerk or something like that, you're probably spending more time in some of these positions that you might be able to relax, but your heart rate still has to keep working, and there's peripheral resistance, so the heart is pumping maybe a little bit differently, and there's a greater anaerobic component. And what we often see with 32s is most of the sets spent in that sort of red zone, or that zone 5, or above 90% 1RM, 90% of your max heart rate. Sorry. So being as relaxed as you can, at least in sort of MSE type lifters for males. Maybe for like the really elite guys, they can probably keep it a bit lower for longer. But they might actually have greater oxygen cost if we put the mask on to measure how much oxygen they utilize using 24s and going like way faster. So again, you coming back to what you were saying before, you really nailed it, because there's so many variables with kettlebell sport. You've got to get the right weight so it's high enough so it gets your heart rate up, but you also got to get the right weight so you can get the tempo up ideally.
Hmm.
And I was lucky enough to do some stuff that we didn't publish, but we did some oxygen. It wasn't a VO2 max test per se, but we looked at just some um, elite lifters doing snatch, and some also amateur lifters and stuff like that. But some of the guys, one guy did over 200 snatches with a 32 and with one hand change, and his VO2 max is way higher than we've seen in any other like kettlebell sport or kettlebell thing that's been published. Whereas we had another guy going much slower, like 16 RPM, and it was sort of impressive, but sort of modest thing, because again, he was lighter, and he was having to relax a bit more and sort of manage his fatigue levels to get optimal amount of reps. And when you're doing a VO2 max, you're probably starting off slower and then trying to really hurt yourself at the end, and you probably end up with less reps. But with kettlebell sport as well, if you're going really slow in the beginning, that can also be quite taxing. So
Hmm.
just, if you're doing 6 RPM with the snatch, your traps and shoulders will get tired just from holding the bell and things like that. So that's where we've got to really sort of tease out the best way to go about that. But generally speaking, I think if you're around 10 or more reps long cycle, or 20 or ish or more reps with snatch, you're probably getting closer to what would be better for your VO2 max and things like that.
So, there's a lot of discomfort with, well, really with any lifting. When you're doing a deadlift, when you're doing a squat, like I don't want to be like it's painful, but it's not really that comfortable, right? Because you're trying to advance. But with kettlebell sport, what do you find it helps athletes learn to push through that discomfort level to make it the whole 10 minutes? Because a lot of athletes, they'll say the 7 minute mark is what kills them. Like they'll struggle to get past 7 minutes because at the 7 minute mark, when their heart rate has really started to now climb, and they're trying to manage this discomfort of sitting with the bell, especially if you're doing double bells, um, sitting with the bells in rack or whatnot. What have you found is good for athletes to help manage that discomfort or learn to be able to push through it more easily?
Yeah, again, really good question. I'll stop saying that actually. They are all really good questions. But yeah, so I think first and foremost is experience. So a lot of lifters, as you get more experience, you really benefit from sort of dipping your toe into the water, doing like a 7, 8 minute set, and you can kind of tell what you do for 10 minutes. But if you've never done a 10-minute set, or you've only done a couple, it's such a mental battle. So knowing that you've done it before makes a huge difference. And I often think about 10-minute sets in terms of, one, you're trying to survive, and then two, you're trying to sort of get a higher level than you've done previously. So with that mindset, you know you can do the 10 minutes, but it's how many reps you can get versus I've never done the time. I'm just trying to survive the time, or I've done a 10-minute set, and on a good day I should be able to do a 10-minute set, but I'm not sure I can. Um, So those people benefit more from doing more 10-minute sets, or building up to it slowly, and having the confidence and experience that they can do it. And then they can sort of leverage that experience to help pace themselves and deal with that discomfort. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is working on their weakness. So if the grip's a limiting factor, maybe working on some grip stuff, or if the rack for a lot of people is a limiting factor, if they just improve that slightly, then they'll be able to rest more between each rep, and then that will make it so much easier. Um, and yeah, so
You know,
so
I
so
like that you
addressing.
bring up confidence, because if anybody has competed before, it's in your head, like, I could just put these down, I could just stop. I want to stop. And, um, the ground's just right there. It's not that far away. I
Yeah,
can put the bells down. But having that confidence to keep going, be like, okay, I can't stop. I can't stop because like I'm supposed to go the whole 10 minutes. Like,
yeah, exactly. And I think another aspect with that is with is just trying to bring yourself back into the moment, or back into the process. And if you're processing off your breathing, or you're sorry, pacing off your breathing, you can try to bring it back to like thinking about, okay, whatever breath and then rep, or you can watch the time, or
oh, that's the
thinking about
worst.
certain.
That would be the
Yeah,
worst
I
for me.
mean,
I try not to watch the time.
yeah, it's a funny one. Like literally, so I competed on Saturday and it's Monday morning here, um, and a few weeks before I did 69 reps on long cycle with the 32s, and I thought I did 70, and so I've done 70 in a comp once before, and at the nationals last year, I think I did 70 reps, but I got a couple of no reps. So I'm really keen to try and get 70 or above again. But on this weekend, I was, it was at a fitness expo, so there was a lot of crazy people walking around. It was a bit humid. Everything's a bit nuts. So I had that distinct kind of moment where it's like I can choose to really try and hurt myself um, by sprinting the last 2 or 3 minutes, and I just didn't like I couldn't quite bring myself to do that. So I ended up with 67 reps, and the reps were pretty nice and things like that. And often, I should say as well, having a judge and going through the process with a judge is obviously different to doing it by yourself, and that can be something that really throws out new people. And that's why I usually just encourage people just to get a few things under their belt. But there's so many different factors. Like again, on the weekend, it's quite humid. The belt, like it's a little bit tricky. So I managed like 10 or 11 reps in the last minute, but usually I'd sort of try to increase my RPM for like the last 2 or 3 minutes, but I sort of kept it pretty consistent. Like I did a couple of 7 RPM sets and then mainly just cruised at 6. Um, but there's like a moment where you're like, I've got to really dig deep and try and hurt myself kind of thing to push, or you sort of running or sprinting towards the end and you're not sure how far you can hold that tempo for. And some people are really good at just holding the same tempo the whole way through. Um, but oftentimes how I train, and coming back to say cross training, I often like to do some easier cycling, or like sprint interval training where I just max sprint. And that can sort of raise up your um, lactate and anaerobic sort of threshold. So often you might get better at sprinting by adding that in, which can be a little bit harder. Or you can do that with kettlebell sports, just doing max sprints and things like that. But yeah, again, coming back to the weekend, it's like I was pretty happy with the set overall. Coaching people, there's a lot going on, but would have been nice to just have that mindset, just to really push. If I sort of held that tempo for 90 seconds or a bit more, I would have got my 70 reps. But of course, if you go too hard like I did last year, you ended up getting a few more no reps because some of the jerks can get a bit janky, or like you don't. lock out as well as you can, or you've just changed your tempo too dramatically for the judge, and maybe you're not holding fixation as well as you could, and or you yeah moving in and out of the positions too quickly. So
Yeah, I think people
yeah,
also
it's
underestimate like the variance of what it's going to be like between an at-home or a local competition versus maybe nationals versus worlds. There's just a lot more playing into what's going on around you when you're at a high level competition. You can't necessarily maybe warm up the way you normally do. You only might have there like maybe 20 or 30 minutes to work with the bells. Then you got to wait. Then people, so there's just you're dependent on the judge and the type of judge, um, potentially for how your reps are going to go. There may not be air conditioning, there's just such a variance and the additional stressors that you see at various competitions. And I think sometimes people are unprepared for how much that's going to change their lifting potentially. Um, so I mean, sometimes you're only as good as the day. Some days I feel like I could do 100 reps, and some days you're like, it's not going to happen.
and that's yeah, that really does make a big difference, doesn't it? Like often in the gym, like I usually give myself sort of a bit of a range. It's like I'll do a 7 to 10 minute set or something like that. And if you're having a good day, maybe you get through a 10 minute set or something. And um, before Worlds last year in Italy, like I got my best ever training PB with like 73 reps with the long cycle. But at the Worlds, I got 64 reps, which is like the lowest result I've had in competition for ages. But I was probably locking out that just a little bit longer, and I think I got a couple of no reps. I think I got two no reps or something. So like that can make a difference. Like just tuning into your judge, maybe they want you to hold it a bit more. And um, I think generally the warm up area was hot, and we were coming from Australian winter, and and it's like 3 a.m. when you're lifting, kind of thing. So the time difference is very different. Um, but ultimately, like it didn't really affect my result or performance, and I was happy with how everything went because in those in that environment, that was the best I could do, and it was quite humid. I heard the year before it was much tougher conditions as well, so
Oh
that's
my gosh,
so
the year before, they everybody was just was crazy sweating.
yeah,
People
yeah,
were putting chalk all the way up to the tops of their arms. Like it was just because it was so warm, humid. They, brought in fans to kind of help pull off the athletes because people were dropping bells and stuff just because they're getting sweaty. Which I hate the fan. I feel like it makes me feel like I can't breathe when it's blowing into my face. Um, it does cool me down, but it's like if you've ever been on an Aerodyne bike and that wind from the wheel is coming up to your face. At our gym, I put duct tape over it because I don't want it blowing on me. Because it
yeah.
makes me
Okay.
feel like I can't breathe.
Hmm. Yeah, in Australia, we sometimes have fans at competitions and sometimes not. At on the weekend, someone brought an external fan, which I was like, oh, that's pretty smart, pretty smart, and they let them sort of use that. And then I think they made a fortune renting it out to other people because it was quite humid there. But I've sort of started to get used to using a fan, but I try not to use a fan. Um, bec- um, because if you can prepare for, or if you can build like a buffer and you can prepare for a bit more worst case scenario, you can often get away with it a bit more. Or if you always train with a fan, then you might get into a bit of trouble. But coming back to VO2 max testing, an interesting thing for a lot of cycling protocols, for cyclists specifically, they will usually put a fan there because that cools you down. And you know, all of those things get taken into account by your brain in terms of managing your fatigue and things like that. And if your core temperature gets too hot, then it sort of turns down your volume on what you can do and the output that it lets you have to keep you typically to keep you safe. Anyway, that's what a lot of people sort of think. But yeah, having that wind going past you can help cool you down. But obviously, if that's pushing chalk into your face or you just don't like it, then it gets in your head and it's annoying. So like, because we're not, well, some people like to do things for an hour and but typically, 10-minute sport, you can probably get away with a bit more. But if you're cycling for long periods of time, then that's probably quite useful. Um, but yeah, all of that stuff. And the other big one is the kettlebell shape. And often um, the shape can make a big difference. If you're used to training with a 33 mil handle and then it's a 35 mil handle, or the window is just slightly different, it makes a huge difference. And the more experienced you are with dealing with that, the more you can like adjust and things like that.
Filled
And
bell versus a hollow bell.
yeah, exactly. We've got a range of different bells behind me. And yeah,
That
where the
that way
center
we
of
know
mass
that you
is,
work with kettlebells.
yeah, yeah. I should have just put all the red ones so it looks tougher.
Yeah,
But
we only work with 32 here.
yeah, yeah. Um, but actually, Cindy was very gracious and she lent me some 2 kilo and 4 kilo kettlebells for the kids one. So I'm keen to try that out. And just I usually use the 4 kilo when I'm demonstrating things because I get lazy um, when I'm not sort of training myself. But
What, so sorry, what do you think, when we're talking about some of the benefits for kettlebell sport, what types of sports do you think best benefit from training similarly to the way kettlebell sport athletes train? Because not all of my lifters compete. Some people may just come in to do it for physiological benefits. So, what type of sports do you think are best fitted to utilize that type of training to their benefit? Is this also a good question?
yeah, yeah, no, it is. But I was making a point to not say that. So you can go like sort of the specific stuff or the non-specific stuff. So if you're say a runner or like trail runner or an ultra runner, you probably don't want to. You want to, and you're trying to build up your strength and you might find doing more strength and power work with the bells is a great way to do it. And sometimes they're a bit adverse to lifting a barbell, so something like that can doing swings or snatches can be really good because we don't have the same pounding on the body as well, and it's usually like a nice smooth application of force, at least with the swings and snatches and cleans and things like that. Whereas things like or sports that don't involve sort of running um, can really benefit, particularly a lot of grapplers and things like that. If um, or potentially rowers, things like that. So you've got that element of grip sort of stuff, and you're moving your body, and you're not sort of loading up things that you might find a little bit problematic. Um, you can even look at things with kettlebells, improving things like balance and power. And my friend Neil, who has more of a hard style background, but he's a physio, he looked at like older people training, and it had this huge range of benefits. So I think that's where you can cover off a lot of bases with a kettlebell, and you can also just use more generic or non-specific kettlebell exercises like presses and rows and lunges and squats to some extent. Obviously, you might not be able to load up as much as on a bar, but for a lot of people, you can still develop decent strength, or you can do single leg squats. It's really good for that stuff. Um, so I've been lucky enough to work with a few different elite athletes, and say in Australia, if you've got Australian rules football, um, you might like to do swings, uh, or you could do some snatches or something to work on um, hamstring development. So specifically, also fast contractions in the eccentric or the absorbing contraction can specifically recruit more of those fast twitch fibers, which is not the case on the concentric or the shortening contraction. So that follows what's called the size principle. And what that means is you recruit your slow twitch fibers first, and then over time you recruit your fast twitch fibers. But the amount of force application has to exceed a threshold for those things to work. And in bodybuilding, or sort of typical bodybuilding, when you lift a submaximal weight submaximally to failure, when you start, you might recruit more of your slow twitch fibers at first. And then once they get tired, you start to work more the fast twitch fibers. And that's where that mindset of like the set doesn't start till it starts to burn kind of thing, when that kicks in. Um, and you can use that approach for conditioning for kettlebell sport, but I think that can be quite mentally taxing. And I often prefer more um, submaximal weight done explosively, or submax or sort of near maximal kind of weight, because it's just a lot less volume. But if you take that example of a submaximal weight done explosively, if your intention is to move it as quickly as possible, you're going to recruit more muscle. So you'll start to kind of synchronize the slow and fast twitch muscle fibers to work quickly. So again, in the case of the hamstring, or say if you're doing a swing, just for simplicity, you're going to sort of work those hamstrings, and maybe if it's quick enough, you'll on the absorbing or the negative or the eccentric muscle action, we're going to recruit those fast twitch fibers and possibly some of the slower twitch fibers, depending on the duration. And then on the concentric, we're going to sort of synchronize everything, and we're also going to use the tendon. So if things are done sort of with that stretch shortening cycle, or that plyometric, or faster things, where so the muscle is going to contract hard and the tendon is like a stiff rubber band at the end, that might be at a point where it'll start to stretch it, and that stretch on the tendon gets the tendon to adapt, because the body has all these things that sense force and stretch and things like that. And if it senses the tension on the end there and it's being stretched, that will trigger it to adapt, which is really amazing. So by doing the swing and then powerfully moving forward, you're going to get these huge range of benefits, and it's often not with a max load. And that can be very specific in terms of a velocity and a movement standpoint to say AFL athlete, or running athletes, or sprinting athletes, team sport athletes can really benefit from that. And it's a little bit different to say a power clean, or a hang power clean. You do have that absorption and then powering up, but it's often a little bit simpler to learn a swing. And you've got that sort of, the other thing is you've got that cyclical motion, and that, sorry, I'm getting a bit off topic here, the centripetal force as well. So the kettlebell is trying to pull you forward, and that loads the spine up a bit differently as well. So that's sort of those sprinting style athletes can really benefit from that kind of approach, where, you grapplers and things like that, you don't have to pound the pavement, especially if you're a bigger guy. You can do snatches and you're getting some benefit from the grip, and you can also sort of pace yourself, and grappling is quite interesting because you get used to those isometric holds, or holding weight on your body. And things like doing the rack position, you get used to sort of having things on your chest, and you can kind of move your chest a bit differently, and that might have application to sort of martial arts in some extents as well there. And then, so you've got your sort of endurance athlete, where you can do some supplementary type work, and maybe you get some extra sort of muscle strength and things like that. I'm getting a bit off top. I love going on tangents, so I've completely forgotten the question now.
It's
But I think that I
I think what you
sort
were
of,
saying is that kettlebell sport, it can be pretty adaptive for really any other sport. I mean, depending on what you're trying to do, that there definitely can be benefits in there to improve, especially for, more endurance athletes. And I mean, most sports, unless you're just doing like sprints, are last, longer than just a minute. Um, so I think it translates well to a lot of other sports where you are going to be going for an extended period of time. Um, I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, and what's cool about kettlebell sport is you can go, you've got such a wide range of sets and reps you can use, right? You could do heavy one arm jerks or something, or heavy cleans for lower reps, or you could do, you can do an hour of that if you really want to.
I don't suggest
And
anybody do an hour. I don't know how
no,
people make it through a whole hour of swinging. 30 minutes
yeah,
is really, I can't, my brain, I'm just like, is this over yet? I mean, I can do it. It's just, I get really bored.
yeah. It's an interesting one. So I've got a lot of people that do half marathons, and why I actually first got into half marathons was because I had a shoulder injury from doing farmers walks. I was like, my traps and shoulders are not strong enough for my grip, which is a bit of a problem. So I strained a nerve in my shoulder because I was able to hold on to something, but my shoulder was like, bleh. So I stretched a nerve there, which wasn't great. But as a until I had that, I never wanted to do a half marathon set. But what I did was I was like, okay, I'm going to use this. Do I have to use a lighter load? And my body has to get used to it and build up that really big foundation. And that's where I first started doing long cycle with, two bells for half marathon. And I used a very specific form of training. And what I mean by that is like I'd do, like a 10-minute set, an 11-minute set, blah, blah, blah. Whereas a lot of people for half marathon, once you get more experience, you can kind of do a, 10, a 15 to 20-minute set maybe as a bit of a test, and you kind of know where you're at. But especially for multi-switch events, as long as you do enough volume in your training session, like maybe you do a pentathlon or you do a biathlon work or even triathlon work, and you're getting 15 minutes or more volume, you can often um, go around and then perform a half marathon. But again, that comes with a lot more experience. Once we sort of used to being able to back off, or you can really tune into your body and get your pace in. And if you're doing one arm long cycle, you've got a good rack position. You can deal with a lot of stuff. So they had a marathon yesterday morning, and uh, some of the hands after the marathon stuff, or even the half marathon, because it's quite humid, was pretty nasty. Yeah, so that's where it's sort of cost to benefit. Um, yeah, and I quite like the half marathon stuff because I think it's good base building for your 10-minute sets in some context. Not, if it does your head in and you just hate it, it's probably not worthwhile doing it. But yeah, and coming back to when I was doing that more specific approach initially for my first sort of set, you sometimes you're like, oh, I'll just put on some TV in the background, so you're not really that present with the set. You just sort of
That's what one of my
getting
other
through it.
lifters does when she's got to train. She just puts on like a Netflix movie. I'm like, well, you're not going to have that
Yeah,
here. Um, do you think, a lot of times when, we have people come into the gym, we have a martial arts facility, and people will say, oh, well, I'll start jujitsu, but, I want to get in shape first. Do you feel like, kettlebell sport, people can just, beginners can just jump in and start training, or is this something they should come with a, uh, a level of endurance already?
yeah. So with a lot of people coming into kettlebell sport, you'll have the classic different archetypes. Unless you're like a young kid getting into it, more often than not, someone's like goes to the gym regularly. Um, maybe they've got a hard style background, so they're lifting kettlebells, or they're like an endurance athlete because they find kettlebells a bit more appealing because they don't want to lift barbells or something like that, and it's not too different to some extent. So if you take the sort of lifter who, just say a bodybuilder, just for whatever, um, we probably don't need to worry so much about strength and things like that, but maybe it's more like flexibility and building a bit of a base and endurance. And that's where I like to use, say, pause jerks just to make sure you can hit the key positions. So um, more often than not, I'd recommend just starting and practicing the technique. But if you can only get your arm to here, that you maybe you have to do swings or cleans or something to get started. But hopefully, if you can get into a relatively good overhead position, um, then you can start to do things. Sometimes people do also struggle with the second dip, or the lowest point of that second dip is the thing that people really struggle with. And then, not that many people can go straight into doubles. So I guess it comes down to your limiting factor. So if you've got this bodybuilder, maybe they need to work a bit more on their flexibility and endurance. If you've got the endurance athlete, maybe they need to work on their flexibility and strength. And so the bodybuilder will probably benefit from, maybe they can still do their strength training, maybe just tone down the volume a little bit, or just add in some lighter bell work or some different drills. The endurance athlete, they can start to use some bells. Hopefully, they're not too wobbly and they're not going to hurt themselves, and just again work on that flexibility. And then, sort of the person hasn't done anything, you can just slowly ease them into it. But I think ultimately it's a case by case. But you would benefit from being able to hit the key positions. Um, just
I do think the flexibility
before.
part is probably the hardest for people to overcome. It
Yeah.
requires either a lot of adjustment in the way they're going to hold the bells, which the way they might have to hold them is maybe not the most efficient way. But I feel like the mobility portion or flexibility portion can be you know, a, a big holdback for people versus the endurance portion for new people. I mean, obviously if you're coming into a gym or you're going with a coach, you're going to be starting out light, and so it's going to progressively get more, and that's where you're going to build your endurance. So
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find with kettlebell sport, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot, is it's, I mean, particularly for the classic lifts, you can't just be good at them. You have to work at it, and it takes a lot of time. Um, and with the flexibility aspect, you often see people who do doubles can transfer over to singles quite well, but not really the other way around, because the doubles require greater amounts of flexibility and to some extent
and a
strength
lot
and
more
things like that.
and a lot more weight. If they're going from 16 kilogram one arm, now you're effectively lifting 32 kilograms over your head each time. Yeah, it's the same weight in both arms, but the force that's on the legs and on your body to move that amount of weight is significantly higher. So it's a bigger jump than, going the other direction.
And you see often with the snatch or things like that, if people are a bit tight or one arm exercises, they might have just a slight side bend away, and that just gives their body just this little bit more room, and their shoulder blade doesn't have to rotate as much and things like that. Whereas when you've got two, you can't do that. So it just
Mhm.
makes it a little bit more challenging. Um, so yeah, I think, yeah, it's you can build flexibility with kettlebell sport exercises, but having that baseline flexibility makes a big difference. And often I quite like adding in Jefferson curls and hangs on the bar and things like that, or rack holds or rack walks. But yeah, long term, you just have to do it for a long time. So I don't. Sometimes people
You're
get
just
that.
going to
Oh, I
have to
can't just
suffer
be
for
good.
a bit.
Yeah, you can't just be good straight away. I mean, maybe if you're a beast, you can get away with some of the one arm lifts pretty quickly, but yeah, you just have to get used to it over time. And being in the sport for longer is the way to ultimately improve your performance and not getting burnt out. So for some people, that's, some people love it and can do sessions all the time, and other people can only do it, a couple of times a week, and they just do some other stuff and things like that. But yeah, it's about finding that right balance, I think.
Probably, I don't remember what competition it was, but there was some competitions ago that when I showed up to Worlds, it was really the first time I had seen somebody significantly older lifting kettlebells. I think there was like an 83, 79-year-old, something like that.
Oh, wow.
Um, that was lifting. I mean, I was just like, I mean, I think he was doing 12s, but um, I think it kind of goes to show you because a lot of people come into this sport later in life just because it's not very common in most countries, unless you live in Russia or Ukraine or there's
Yeah.
it's not very common. So you don't hear about it until you're 35 and you just happen to see somebody doing it or you end up at a gym where it's being done. Um, but to see that this person who probably started lifting when he was young has now still lifting into his 80s and competing, that you can come in the sport later in life. You can still get good at it and do it for a considerable amount of time if you're training smart and so there's
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I remember, I'm not sure if that was Latvia 2018. I think we were both there. And yeah, that was the first
it
time I
might
seen
have been
international,
Latvia.
yeah, international competition. And you sort of rock up at different times and you see the juniors, and then, yeah, you see these older people, and like, oh, wow, that's amazing. And in Australia, there, Don Grant trains a lot of amazing, like, older ladies. And so I'm in Melbourne. He's in Bendigo, so it's about 2 hours away from me. But yeah, and that was some of the women that I mentioned. I think they can do like snatch 30-minute sets, uh, 24 kilo. Really awesome work, and they got into it in their 60s or something, and they've just built up to it over time and just um, gotten really strong. And I think one thing that particularly in the West, so to speak. Um, Often there's a few more women that do it. I'm not sure if it's like an ego thing for men. It's like 216, that's so light. Um, they're sort of, whereas culturally it's a bit different in sort of Eastern Europe, they can kind of see like where the challenges are and things like that. But often when men like, they're like, oh, 216s are so easy. If they get over that magical 10, 15 reps and everything kind of goes to shit, especially if they can't move into key positions or relax in between reps and things like that. They just really struggle. So,
I
um,
usually when I've had some guys that jump into the class, I think they get discouraged because all the girls have been lifting for a pretty significant amount of time and they're coming in, they're like, wait, so I'm going to be lifting less weight. And you're like, well, yeah, but I mean, like they've been training for like 7 years, 5 years. But I think sometimes it's kind of hard to realize like, 'cause you're like, oh, well, this is only 30 pounds. The 16-kilogram bell is, it's just 30 pounds. Um, I'll be able to do it. And then they start going and they really struggle because one, you're trying to learn the movement, which is complicated and takes a number. It usually takes people about, I'd say, a month to really kind of get comfortable with the movement. Um, and then on top of that, it's hard endurance wise.
yeah, absolutely. I've had the same problem. And most guys are okay, but occasionally, like, you get some guys with an ego. They're just like, oh, I got to lift more. And you're like, mate, just just calm down. You're gonna hurt yourself. And like on the weekend, we had Val doing biathlon, and she did like 60 jerks with 220s, and then like around 100 snatches. And Haley, who's really light. And she did 60 reps long cycle with 220s and stuff. And a lot of guys would, they might see that and then be like, oh, I can do that. And it's like, there's no way you can, you know, do that at all. Like and they're just really strong ladies. And they just look sort of like normal people, I guess. But
So
yeah,
what
it's just
what
mm,
advice would you give someone who is just starting kettlebell sport, but maybe they got into it because they kind of because of the competition side of it? What advice would you give for new lifters that are going to want to compete in the future?
yeah, absolutely. I think, well, obviously having a coach is going to help, and that's not realistic for everyone, depending on where you are and things like that. Or you can get online coaches or whatever. But yeah, starting off with just taking your time, particularly initially, and yeah, working on those, being able to hit those key positions, and then building a base. And if you're, um, yeah, got working on your weaknesses as well, and if you need to go and okay, I'm gonna just do lower volume of kettlebell sport stuff, but I might do some push-ups and pull-ups and squats and lunges and swings just to build a bit more general strength. So you want to build a nice buffer with your sort of general physical qualities like your endurance and strength and flexibility. So once you can kind of get those areas under control, you can or work on your weaknesses and then just slowly, incrementally build it up. And you'll find that there'll be times where you improve quickly, and then there'll be times where it's a bit of a lull and then improve quickly. I think it's also good to do a variety of different lifts. So whether that be doing, maybe you do long cycle for a while, or and then you do biathlon for a while, or you do even some pentathlon, you add in a bit more variety. That can be good initially. The main thing is that you keep chipping away over time. So set yourself kind of a goal of being consistent is the key thing. Working on your limitations. You can try some a greater variety of exercise, and then over time you can sort of you like a funnel. You can focus in on what you want to specialize in later on, and you can map out where you want to get to with the sport, based on how many competitions you want to do. I think it's also really good just to go to competitions, mainly to take part. But if you're a bit anxious about that, watch the competitions. The majority, particularly, I'll speak about Australia, and I've been to a couple in New Zealand, and um, they're usually pretty chill, and people really want to help you. So, excuse me. So people are like often will you can learn a lot by how people go about what they're doing, and you'll learn a lot about the rules and things like that, so you don't get disheartened when um, you do a double swing at the start and then you're sort of done for the set, or you know
That's the worst,
learning sort of
especially if you're at competition.
yeah. So that's a really tough one.
We had one of our lifters last year that I think she was doing, I don't remember if she was doing marathon for the first time. She had just done two-arm long cycle, like the day before, and she just like I wasn't thinking, and she like double swing on like like,
It's
like her
so
first
common.
rapper.
Yeah, when I was in Ireland, 2018 was the first time I saw that they brought that rule in. And this one, I remember this one woman, I think she did 5 minutes, like left side, and then she changed and did a double swing. And then like the judges stopped counting her other set, and she didn't know what was happening. And she just kept going the whole time and just was talking to the judges like, what's going on? And I don't know if there's a language barrier or,
Yeah, I mean, a
yeah, but
lot of
that's
times
so
because
different.
not all the judges speak English when you go to these international competitions, and they are trying to cue you for something that you're doing wrong, but you're up there lifting and you can't figure out, um, what they're wanting, which is it can lead to, you messing up during the lift because you're trying to figure it out, and the communication is just not there. They're also like 20, 30 feet away. So, and there's music going, people are yelling, mostly Australian team, uh, or they have horns. Lots of
Yeah.
competition.
Well, I mean, to your point, like in 2018, I did 32 long cycle and then biathlon, and you feel like you've been run over by a truck. And last year in Italy, I did 32 long cycle, and then because I'm now 41, I can compete as a veteran or masters or whatever. And so I did biathlon 24 kilos, and I sort of like to do that because when you're traveling from Australia, and probably to some extent the US, it's like you're traveling halfway across the world. You're on a plane for like 24 hours. You're like, I'm going to get as much value for money or as much experience time on the platform. It also sort of makes you feel a little bit better because if you're going just for 10-minute set, if you like stuff it up, it feels like there's a lot of pressure on there. But anyway, um, yeah, the snatch. I was getting all these no reps, and I was trying to work out what I was doing. And on one side, I'd often bring my hand up above my shoulder, and so because I was doing that when the bell was overhead, um,
Mm.
I was just getting no reps for that, and I couldn't work it out. And
I think that was a
um,
new rule last year that they kind
yeah,
of
yeah. So
put
I wasn't
in.
ready for that one.
There was quite a
And
few people with that.
and fortunately, the head judge couldn't really speak English, but the person next to them could, and I was sort of actually that was a really wild set. I don't know if you were watching for that one, but the guy next to me, he got he got quite a few no reps to the point where he threw the bell and started. I've
Oh
never
yeah,
seen this
I
happen
was
before,
watching that.
and he started abusing the judge, and I think he was beating me pretty comfortably, and and because of that, I was able to win, which was nice. But so that judge did me a favor, but that was pretty intense. Like that guy was from Ukraine, so I think he might have been a bit stressed out or something. Understandable, but yeah, the judge was able to sort of communicate that my arm was above. But I actually wasn't sure if it was on the backswing or when I was in fixation, so I was like just kept my arm next to my body.
Just pinned it to
Uh,
your body while you're swinging.
yeah, it was a bit funny, but now I'm aware of it and it's um, not too bad. But yeah, it is sometimes hard to keep track of all the rules, even if you've been competing for I don't know how long I've been competing for.
Hmm.
There's often just slight changes which can change things. And once the more experience you have, you can have multiple plans, particularly for things like biathlon or multiple lifts, where you might need to change gears or just change on the fly and you're not sure what's happening. And over the years, you build up, just a range of different experiences. So when, yeah, things just start going a bit haywire, you can just bring it back to the different plans. And that makes a big difference. And that's also really important for beginners. Is often, the stress of a competition or even just hearing, if you're used to training by yourself, you hear the clicking of people doing jerks and things like that. That can sort of muck up your rhythm and, excuse me, like the heels hitting the ground. That can just sometimes throw people out, so they go a bit faster and just breaking away from your plan that you've practiced can really throw you out.
Hmm.
But then when you've done more things, you can play around with different stuff. And I remember my shoulder was a bit tricky that day. I was almost tempted to see if I could do 10 minutes on my right hand, which I don't think I could do. But um, I think I did 6 or 7 minutes on my right, and then I was planning just to sprint on my left. And that's when I was just getting all these no reps when I was just sprinting because I think fixation was okay, but the hand was coming up. So yeah, I had to just yeah, I worked it out, but I probably suffered a handful of no reps, but that's how it goes, I guess. Hmm.
What do you think kind of one of the biggest misconceptions is for kettlebell sport or, people that are new that are coming into the sport?
Yeah, well, coming back to that example of particularly guys, obviously I'm generalizing here, but thinking that you're going to get quite weak doing kettlebell sports, but particularly as you progress and get used to things, you can lift pretty heavy, and that does really carry over to real life application. Um, so the fact that you're going to get weaker doing this stuff, and you can easily just add in a set or two of squats or deadlifts or bench, or usually especially if you're a bit tight, I prefer overhead press. But that's sometimes a misconception that people think you're going to get really weak doing it. And oftentimes in everyday life, grip strength is a limiting factor.
You never know when
And
you're going to be hanging off a building.
yeah, that's it. That's it. You need to be able to do it for at least half an hour to survive.
Yeah.
Or I'm not sure what you have to do in cliffhanger, but have one person here and press them up and then do a one arm muscle up. And yeah, you have to be able to do at least that level of conditioning. But yeah, I think it carries over really well to everyday life because you're using your whole body. You're learning to coordinate your whole body together. You've also got a sequence of things. So, like if you're doing a bicep curl, it's just the one sequence. Whereas if Olympic lifting or you've got different phases of lift, so you need to work on your timing and coordination. Um, so that will also get developed, and you will improve your strength and um, like on the weekend there, I'm sort of pretty weedy, I guess, compared to some of these other people who go to the fitness expos. But I did pretty well on some of like there was these weird blocks to lift up and stuff, and I was just having a go at that, and I did pretty well for my size and things like that. And some of the strongmen there are like, oh, yeah, that's pretty good. Like, they just got meaty hands, but you do really well for power to weight ratio. I think it does really well, and often you become quite a really well-rounded athlete. And for everyday life, being pretty fit and pretty strong and pretty mobile, it carries over really well to activities of daily living, or often with a bit of a base, you can find yourself trying different things, particularly as we age. You see people who don't do anything and they really fall off, and you probably do your hamstring running 10 meters to run after your child or something. Whereas with kettlebell sport, you can kind of
Isn't
put
that
your mind
always
to
the
things.
case? That's how everybody always tears their hamstring, right?
Yeah,
Racing their kid or actually I think that's when my dad tore his hamstring when we were kids. We were racing. I think I was like 8 or 9. He's like,
yeah,
"Oh shit,
right. Oh no.
I'm gonna beat you so bad," and then tore
Ah,
tore his hamstring.
you must have been trying really hard. Yeah, well, that's it. It's like you're not conditioned, and you condition your whole body with kettlebell sport, and that way, particularly as you get older, you have to be a little bit more cautious about just jumping into different things. But the proof's in the pudding. Like you see some of the older lifters, and they're just so good. And there's these world champion lifters in their 40s, and I think even
Well,
Fedor
I don't think
Fulglev, I
people,
think.
a lot of people have seen until like you show them some of these, especially like the male ultra, high level lifters, professional lifters that are just completely stacked. And you're like, well, I'm sure they do lift weights as well as doing kettlebell, but 80% of, what they have is from lifting because that's what they do 80% of the time, and weightlifting is probably supplemental for them. And it's just to keep them, balanced for the areas it's not working. But a lot of what they look like is because of kettlebell sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And more and more in the research, they're now sort of finding out that you can build muscle with a wide range of different sort of rep ranges and things like that. It's just about getting the appropriate stimulus, and you know, you build as much muscle doing higher reps. Admittedly, you have to be closer to failure. There's different studies on that, but then you can also build it with lower reps and things like that. But you have to do enough sets and things like that. And that's, yeah, where to your point, like that 80-20 works really well. 80% of the time doing kettlebell stuff. And you'll find once you sort of unlock those limitations and you start to push yourself, yeah, it takes care of a lot of things. And when you focus on performance, I think it's really mentally much healthier. and often your physique and things like that just sort of fall into shape, and you do quite well with that sort of stuff.
Well, we're coming on an hour and 15 minutes now. So, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you feel like um, people should know about kettlebell sport and adaptations or anything?
Yeah, not not particularly. But I would say one thing that is again very unique about kettlebell sport is um, similar to weightlifting and powerlifting. The sport you can do kind of in the gym, so you can build strength by just small changes in and I guess it's specific to what you're trying to do. But if you're trying to snatch 24 kilos, you do some stuff with 26 or 28. That's really going to be specific kind of strength stuff, and then you can go the other way, trying to work more on endurance. You can bring it down to 22 or 24 or 16 or all these different things. So you've got a lot of um, different avenues of building strength, or you can do different variations on the lift to make it harder, like a dead snatch, works your hips a bit more, or you can do a swing snatch. So not being afraid to do a bit more variety. And I think it's an awesome sport as long as you don't burn yourself out. And uh, it's easy to take yourself pretty seriously with kettlebell sport, but sometimes you need to sort of take a step back and not take it too seriously, or in the context of longevity and things like that. And you'll have good days and other days where it gets a bit harder. But I think that's probably enough rambling for me. But yeah, happy to jump back on and talk about other questions or things like that if that's helpful at another time. I'm sure
Yeah,
I'll
if
come up with some
I'll
more
kind of
random.
watch, and if people put any questions, or if there's questions that people have specifically, if you add it into the in the comment section, I can kind of go through, and James could probably just put together like a short little video explaining and answering some of those questions if you have some. I know we kind of like talked about a lot of different things today. So, but I really appreciate you coming on here. Everybody that comes on here is not paid, thank God. But they come on just to
Yeah.
help, share their information, because I think part of, why kettlebell sport, what keeps it growing is like us just being open with like the knowledge that we have. That I know when I first started, like everything was just kind of so secretive. Like you don't want to let anybody know how you're training. Like, but a lot of that information I think can be shared and pushed out to people so they can be more involved in the sport. Because a lot of times, especially here
That's
in
a,
the you go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that's a really interesting point. Because yeah, back in the day, it was really like that. And in Australia, we probably also got a slightly different flavor to things in the US and the UK and things like that, based on who has been to the different countries and stuff like that, and who's built relationships with those people to bring them over. And initially, Steve Cotter did the first rest in peace sort of workshop around 2006 or something, and then Ginkgo came out, and then Valery Fedorenko and Denisov came out a few times, and then later Sergei Rudnev and Rachinsky came out, and Denis Vasiliev. And 2018 we had Anton Anasenko. But in Europe, in England, it might be more Anton Anasenko from the beginning, or things like that. In America, you probably got a bit of everything really. Um, but you can see how these different, it was quite secretive, and it was like I was very lucky to Emily was going over to the US to do training with the WKC people, and was picking up different things. But their bias was more towards one arm lifting initially, um, but each person sort of had their own training style. But yeah, and it was a bit secretive, so it was kind of like these Chinese whispers around different styles and methodology, and yeah, people sort of were filling in the gaps because they weren't sure about different things, and it wasn't until later that it became a bit more transparent about what people actually do, and you can get better a lot of different ways with kettlebell sport. And I tend to lean more towards, with the general conditioning, trying to focus on that minimum effective dose so it's not as mentally taxing as because you're probably taxing yourself mentally with your kettlebell sport training. So don't try not to burn you out with that other stuff. Whereas other people might, really go in for that very specific general conditioning, and it can work really well, but it can also be a double-edged sword depending on the person and things like that. So that's where those intermediate lifters have to be careful with just getting annihilated by the general strengthening and conditioning and the sport. So often you sort of need to choose one. Yeah. Anyway, that's probably the last thing I'll add there.
Okay. Well, like I said, I really appreciate you coming on. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.